I read my father's text and typed a distinct two-word reply. Understood. They expected me to vanish, to remain a nameless shadow in our family portrait. However, they did not realize that court on Thursday was not a vague concept. It was the exact place where the truth would be read aloud, right in front of the very man they were so desperate to impress. My name is Natalie Kincaid. I am 38 years old, and I have spent the better part of my adult life strictly compartmentalizing the two distinct halves of my existence. On one side, there is the version of me that exists within the sterile, mahogany-paneled walls of the Everett McKinley Dirksen United States Courthouse in Chicago. On the other side, there is the daughter my parents tolerate, the shadow living in the periphery of my older brother's blinding spotlight. It was 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon when the vibration of my phone shattered the focused silence of my chambers. Outside the window, the gray Chicago sky threatened a late spring storm, the kind that bruised the horizon and made the city feel small and huddled. I turned my phone over. The screen lit up with a message from my father. It was not a question. It was a directive. Do not come to the retirement party. Your brother's boss is a federal judge. If you appear, it will cause difficult questions. I stared at the glowing pixels. I did not blink. I did not feel the sting of tears or the flush of embarrassment that used to plague me in my 20s. Instead, I felt a cold, clinical detachment, the same sensation I experienced when reviewing a poorly constructed motion to dismiss. It was a feeling of clarity. My father, Gordon, had spent the last 6 months planning this retirement party. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of his mid-level corporate career, a night where he could leverage his social standing to bolster the family name. But more importantly, it was a stage for Ethan. Ethan Kincaid, my brother, the assistant United States attorney, the golden boy. In the mythology of the Kincaid family, Ethan was the sun around which we were all expected to orbit. He was loud, charismatic, and undeniably skilled at the political game of the legal world. My parents spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for war heroes or saints. When they introduced him, they used his full title. They practically saluted. And then there was me. To my parents, my career was a blurred footnote. They knew I worked for the government. They knew I went to a law school that was just as prestigious as Ethan's, though they often forgot the name of it. Over the years, through a combination of their willful ignorance and my own exhaustion, my role had been reduced in their minds to something safe and administrative. In the family narrative, Natalie Kincaid worked around the courts. Perhaps I was a clerk, maybe a paralegal, possibly a court reporter. They never asked for specifics, and eventually, I stopped offering them. It was easier to let them believe I was the supportive, invisible sister than to force them to acknowledge a reality that might overshadow their precious son. Difficult questions, my father had written. I set the phone down on my desk, right next to the heavy, leather-bound case files for the week. I understood exactly what he meant. If I attended the party, someone might ask me what I did for a living. If I answered honestly, it would complicate the simple, perfect picture my father was trying to paint for Ethan's boss. The boss in question was Judge Malcolm Waverly. I knew him, of course. We worked in the same building. We rode the same elevators. We ate lunch in the same judicial dining room. But my father and Ethan did not know this. They assumed that the gap between a federal prosecutor like Ethan and a federal judge like Waverly was a vast canyon, bridgeable only by extreme deference and social maneuvering. They did not realize that I stood on the other side of that canyon. I stood up and walked to the closet in the corner of my office. I opened the door and looked at the black robe hanging there. It was heavy, synthetic, and devoid of ornamentation. It was the uniform of absolute authority. I ran my hand over the fabric. My parents thought my presence would be awkward because I was a nobody. They feared that my lack of ambition would embarrass Ethan in front of a powerful man. They were terrified that Judge Waverly would ask, "And what does your sister do?" And the answer would be underwhelming. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. I walked back to my desk and opened the digital calendar on my secure laptop. I needed to confirm the docket. The screen refreshed, displaying the schedule for the week. Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning, United States versus Oakhaven Financial. I looked at the list of counsel. For the defense, a high-priced team from a private firm. For the prosecution, the United States Attorney's Office. Lead counsel, Ethan Kincaid. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. This was the collision course we were on. Ethan had been assigned to a major financial fraud case, a career-defining prosecution involving shell companies and accounting malpractice. It was the kind of case that made headlines. It was the reason he was so eager to impress his superiors. And through the blind rotation of the court assignment system, that case had landed in my courtroom. I had seen Ethan's name on the docket 2 weeks ago. I had gone through the standard ethical recusal analysis. Under the relevant codes of conduct, I was not required to recuse myself simply because the prosecutor was my brother, provided there was no financial interest and I could remain impartial. We were not close. We did not socialize. We had no shared assets. And frankly, in the federal circuit, professional overlaps happened. But usually, a judge would step aside to avoid the appearance of impropriety. I had prepared the paperwork to transfer the case to another judge. It was the standard, safe move. I had the motion to recuse drafted and ready to file. I had planned to do it this morning. But then I looked at my phone again. Don't come to the retirement party. My father's text message was not just an exclusion, it was an erasure. It was a confirmation that in their eyes, I was an obstruction to Ethan's success. They were willing to hide me to protect his image. They were ashamed of the version of me they had invented in their heads. I deleted the draft of the recusal order. I was not going to step aside. I was not going to disappear. If Ethan wanted to prosecute a case in the Northern District of Illinois, he could do it in the courtroom he was assigned to. If he had a problem with the presiding judge, he could file a motion for recusal himself. He could stand up in open court, on the record, and explain to the world exactly who I was. He could be the one to admit that his sister was not a filing clerk, but the woman sitting on the bench looking down at him. I picked up the phone and typed my reply to my father. I did not scream. I did not demand an apology. I did not tell him that he was making a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I typed 2 words. I understand. I sent the message. Then I turned my attention back to the case file. United States versus Oakhaven Financial. I began to read. I read with the meticulous, predatory focus that had gotten me appointed to the bench at the age of 34. I scrutinized the motions in limine. I examined the witness lists. I memorized the evidentiary disputes. As I read, I remembered the family dinners from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I remembered the way my mother would interrupt me mid-sentence to ask Ethan if he wanted more roast beef. I remembered the Christmas when I told them I had received a major promotion, and my father had nodded vaguely before turning to Ethan to ask about his fantasy football league. I remembered the feeling of being small, of being gray, of being noise in the background of their symphony. They thought I was safe. They thought I was the backup plan, the spinster daughter who would take care of them when they got old, who had a nice, quiet government job with a pension. They had no idea that I commanded a courtroom where billion-dollar corporations trembled and hardened criminals wept. I looked at the clock. It was now 5:30. The courthouse was emptying out. The clerks were going home. The marshals were doing their final rounds. I stood up and walked to the window again. The rain had started. It slashed against the glass, distorting the lights of the city below. I would not go to the party. I would sit in my apartment. I would drink a glass of wine. I would review my notes. I would let them have their night of glory. I would let my father boast to Judge Waverly about his brilliant son. I would let Ethan preen and smile and pretend he was the only Kincaid who mattered. Let them build their house of cards. Let them stack the lies and the omissions one on top of the other until they reached the ceiling of that banquet hall. Because Thursday was coming. Thursday was not a party. Thursday was a court of law. And in my court, there were no favorites. There were no parents to interrupt the proceedings. There was only the record. There was only the law. And there was me. I sat down at my desk and pulled a fresh legal pad toward me. I picked up my pen. At the top of the page, I wrote the date of the hearing. Thursday, May 15th. Below that, I wrote a single name. Ethan. I drew a line through it, not out of anger, but out of procedure. In my courtroom, he would not be Ethan. He would be Mr. Kincaid, counsel for the government, and he would learn, for the first time in his life, that respect was not an inheritance. It was something that had to be earned. I closed the file. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a storm holding its breath. I was ready. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the ventilation system pushing recycled air through the vents. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the one that cost more than the first car I ever bought, and stared at the nameplate on my desk. It did not say Kincaid. Years ago, when I passed the bar exam, I made a choice that felt like an amputation. I legally adopted my grandmother's maiden name for my professional practice. To the bewildered clerk at the records office, it was just paperwork. To me, it was a survival strategy. I became Natalie Vance. I told myself it was to honor a woman who had actually listened to me when I spoke. But the truth was sharper than that. I wanted to know, with absolute certainty, that when I won a case, or when I was eventually appointed to the federal bench at the absurdly young age of 32, the achievement belonged to me alone. I did not want my father's mid-level corporate connections or Ethan's loud, backslapping network to have any claim on it. So, on the docket for Thursday, the presiding official was listed as the Honorable Natalie Vance. This was why Ethan was sleeping soundly tonight. He saw the name Vance on his case assignment and likely felt a shiver of intimidation, knowing my reputation for procedural ruthlessness, but he did not feel a flicker of familial recognition. To him, Natalie Kincaid was just his quiet sister who shuffled papers somewhere in the government bureaucracy, a woman who probably stamped forms in a basement archive. I rubbed my temples, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. It was not a physical tiredness. It was the deep, sedimented fatigue of being unseen for a lifetime. I remembered the night I tried to tell them. It was 5 years ago. A humid Sunday in July. I had just received the confirmation of my appointment. It is a rare thing to become a federal judge in one's early 30s. It requires a level of excellence that borders on obsession. I had bought a bottle of expensive champagne, costing nearly $300, and brought it to my parents' house for dinner. We were sitting at the patio table. My father was complaining about the humidity, and my mother was fussing over the potato salad. I had cleared my throat, my hands trembling slightly under the table. "I have some news," I had said. "It is about work." My father had looked up, fork halfway to his mouth. "Oh? Did you finally get that transfer to the benefits department you wanted?" I had never wanted a transfer to the benefits department. I had never even mentioned a benefits department. "No, Dad, actually, the president has nominated me to—" "Guess who I ran into today?" Ethan's voice boomed across the table, drowning me out completely. He walked in through the sliding glass door, wearing a tennis polo and a grin that consumed the room. "The district attorney. He told me that my closing argument on the Henderson case is being used as training material for the new hires. Can you believe that? Training material." My mother gasped, dropping the serving spoon. "Ethan, that is incredible. Oh, Gordon, did you hear that? Our son is teaching the new generation." My father beamed, his chest swelling with a pride he had never once directed at me. "That is my boy. A leader. Always a leader." They spent the next 2 hours dissecting Ethan's brilliance. They toasted him with the iced tea. They asked him for every detail of the case. The bottle of champagne sat in my bag, unopened, warming in the summer heat. By the time dessert was served, I had made a decision. I would never tell them. If they could not see me when I was sitting right in front of them, I would not force them to look. I would become exactly what they thought I was: invisible. That silence had become my shield, but now, alone in my chambers with the rain lashing against the darkness of Chicago, the shield felt heavy. My colleagues here at the courthouse did not know about the estrangement. They knew Judge Vance as a woman of terrifying precision. I had a reputation for reading every single footnote in every brief submitted to my court. I did not tolerate typos. I did not tolerate lateness. When a lawyer walked into my courtroom, they knew that if they were not prepared, I would dismantle their arguments with a surgical lack of emotion. I did not need an audience to feel powerful. The gavel was enough. But looking at the file for United States versus Oakhaven Financial, I felt a different kind of tension. I opened the thick binder. The case was a sprawling, ugly mess of white-collar crime. The allegations involved a complex network of shell companies used to inflate assets and hide liabilities. It was exactly the kind of case Ethan loved. It was high profile, complex enough to make him look smart, but clear-cut enough to ensure a win, or so he thought. I began to turn the pages, my eyes scanning the forensic accounting reports. The fraud was sophisticated. The perpetrators had moved money through a dozen different entities, layering the transactions to make them impossible to trace without a warrant. But I had authorized the warrants. The evidence was here. I traced a line of transactions totaling $4 million. The money had moved from Oakhaven Financial to a holding company in Delaware, then to a consulting firm in the Cayman Islands, and finally, it had landed in the accounts of a domestic logistics coordinator. I stopped. My finger hovered over the name of the domestic company. Sterling Ross Logistics. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sterling Ross Logistics was not a famous company. It was a mid-sized supply chain management firm. It was the kind of boring, reliable business that made up the backbone of the economy. It was also the company where my father, Gordon Kincaid, had served as the vice president of regional operations for 20 years. It was the company that was paying for the retirement party I had just been banned from attending. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I reached for my personal laptop and pulled up the invitation my mother had emailed me weeks ago. Before the "don't come" text, I looked at the venue, the Crystal Ballroom at the Palmer House, catering for 200 guests, open bar, live band. I did the mental math. A party like that in downtown Chicago would cost upwards of $50,000, maybe $60,000. My father made a decent living, but he was frugal to the point of paranoia. He checked the price of milk before buying it. There was no way Gordon Kincaid was paying for this party out of his own pocket. The invitation said, in elegant script at the bottom, "Sponsored by Sterling Ross Logistics, in honor of 30 years of service." I looked back at the court file. Sterling Ross was listed as a tertiary beneficiary in the fraud scheme. The prosecution's theory, Ethan's theory, was that Oakhaven Financial had used vendors like Sterling Ross to inflate their invoices. Oakhaven would pay Sterling Ross $100,000 for a service that cost $10,000, and Sterling Ross would hold the difference or funnel it back through another channel. If the allegations were true, the company was not just a passive victim. Someone at the executive level had to sign off on those invoices. Someone had to approve the inflated contracts. Someone like the vice president of regional operations. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my back against the leather chair. The text message from my father suddenly took on a new, horrifying dimension. "Do not come to the retirement party. Your brother's boss is a federal judge. If you appear, it will cause difficult questions." I had assumed the difficult questions were about my lack of prestige. I had assumed it was pure social vanity. But what if it was fear? If I showed up and someone from the company recognized me, not as Natalie the daughter, but as Judge Vance from the federal courthouse, panic would ensue. Or perhaps my father did not know I was a judge, but he knew that I worked around the courts. Maybe he was terrified that I would hear something, see something, or talk to someone who would accidentally reveal that his retirement celebration was being funded by laundered money. Or worse, what if Ethan knew? No, I dismissed that thought immediately. Ethan was arrogant, he was self-absorbed, and he was dismissive of me. But he was not corrupt. He was a Boy Scout who loved the sound of his own morality. If he knew our father was implicated in his biggest case, he would have collapsed under the weight of the conflict of interest. He would have recused himself faster than he could blink. The fact that Ethan was still the lead prosecutor meant he had not looked closely enough at the vendor list. He was chasing the big fish at Oakhaven. He had not bothered to scrutinize the smaller fish swimming in the wake. He did not know that one of those small fish was the company that paid for his college tuition. This was the tragedy of my family. They were so busy looking up, trying to impress the people above them, that they never looked down to see what they were standing on. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was coming down harder now. My father was retiring. He was getting out. This party was his victory lap before he walked away with his pension and his reputation intact. He thought he was safe. He thought he had successfully kept his disappointed daughter away from his glorious son and his prestigious guests. He did not realize that the daughter he silenced was the one holding the gavel. I turned back to the desk. I had a decision to make. I could recuse myself now. I could cite a conflict of interest, seal the file, and walk away. It would save my father. It would save Ethan's career. It would keep the family peace that I had sacrificed so much to maintain. But then I thought about the 2 words I had texted him. I understand. I did understand. I understood that for 30 years. I had been the collateral damage of their ambition, and now, the law required me to be something else. I sat down and picked up my pen. I did not sign the recusal form. Instead, I drafted a subpoena. It was a specific request for additional documentation regarding the vendor contracts of Sterling Ross Logistics for the fiscal years 2021 through 2023. I wanted to see who signed the checks. I was not doing this out of spite. I told myself that firmly. This was the job. I was a federal judge, and I had sworn an oath to administer justice without respect to persons. That included my father. That included my brother. If they had nothing to hide, the inquiry would reveal nothing. But as I signed the order as Natalie Vance, I knew the truth. Innocents rarely threw $60,000 parties for mid-level managers. The silence in the office was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of a clock ticking down to Thursday. I placed the subpoena in the outgoing tray. The game had changed. They were no longer just erasing me. They were erasing the evidence. Tuesday morning arrived with the sterile precision of a scalpel. The air in conference room B was recycled and cool, maintained at exactly 68 degrees. I stood behind the heavy oak door that connected the judge's chambers to the conference area, my hand hovering over the brass handle. I could hear them inside. The defense team for Oakhaven Financial had arrived 5 minutes early. I heard the rustle of expensive papers and the click of briefcases. Then, at exactly 8:59, the door from the hallway swung open. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The air grew louder, more sucked up by a single presence. It was Ethan. I did not need to see him to know it was him. I knew the cadence of his walk, the heavy heel strike of a man who assumes the ground is grateful to receive his step. I knew the projection of his voice, trained to reach the back row of a jury box without a microphone. "Gentlemen," Ethan said. His voice was rich, confident, and utterly relaxed. "I hope you are ready for a short week. I do not intend to let this discovery dispute drag on past lunch." One of the defense attorneys, a man named Silverman, whom I had sanctioned 3 months ago for wasting court time, murmured something low. Ethan laughed. It was his courtroom laugh, a sound that was 50% charm and 50% condescension. "Judge Vance? I am not worried. I looked up her stats. She is a procedural hardliner. She likes efficiency. I can do efficiency. You just give her the paperwork in the right order and she will stamp it. These administrative types are all the same. They want to go home at 5 o'clock. I tightened my grip on the door handle. He thought Judge Vance was an administrator. He thought the person about to decide the admissibility of his evidence was a bureaucrat who watched the clock. He was speaking about me as if I were a stranger, a functionary to be managed, a hurdle to be cleared on his way to glory. He had no idea that Judge Vance was the same sister he had texted 24 hours ago to banish from a family party. I opened the door. The bailiff, a towering man named Marcus, who had been with me since my first day, barked out the command, "All rise." The room scrambled. Chairs scraped against the carpet. The defense team stood up buttoning their jackets. Ethan was the last to rise. He did it with a practiced languor, a slow unfold of his limbs that suggested he was only standing out of politeness, not obligation. I walked to the head of the table. I did not look at them yet. I placed my file on the mahogany surface. I adjusted the cuffs of my black robe. I sat down. "Be seated," I said. My voice was not the voice I used at Sunday dinners. It was not the soft, deferential tone I used when my mother asked me to pass the salt. It was an octave lower, stripped of all warmth, honed by 4 years of silencing unruly courtrooms. I looked up. I looked directly at the prosecution table. Ethan was smiling, reaching for his water glass, his eyes scanning his notes. He looked up to make eye contact, to unleash the charm offensive he had prepared for the spinster judge. His eyes met mine. The glass did not drop, but his hand froze in midair. It was a microscopic moment. To the defense team, it might have looked like he was simply pausing to think, but I knew him. I saw the air leave his lungs. I saw the color drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. His pupils dilated, swallowing the iris. His mouth opened slightly, a reflex of shock that he could not suppress. For 3 seconds, the universe inside that room suspended its laws. Ethan tried to process the data. Natalie, here, robe, Judge Vance, Natalie. The cognitive dissonance was almost violent. He was looking at the sister he treated as a ghost, but she was sitting in the chair of the highest authority in the room. The administrative type he planned to manipulate was the woman whose existence he found inconvenient. I did not blink. I did not smile. I did not give him the smallest nod of familial recognition. I held his gaze with the indifference of a statue. Ethan swallowed. It was a hard, audible gulp. He set the water glass down. His hand shook, just once, a tremor. Then he clenched it into a fist under the table. He forced the mask back on. It was painful to watch. He tightened his jaw, narrowed his eyes, and physically willed his professional persona to return. He was a prosecutor. He was a Kincaid. He could not fall apart. "Good morning, Your Honor," the defense attorney, Silverman, said smoothly. I turned my head away from Ethan, breaking the connection as if he were of no more importance than the stenographer. "Good morning, Mr. Silverman. We are here to discuss the motion in Lamine regarding the admissibility of the Level 3 financial logs. I have reviewed your briefs." I looked back at Ethan. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, like an animal caught in high beams. "Mr. Kincaid," I said. He flinched. He actually flinched at the sound of his own name coming from my mouth in this context. Yes, he stammered. It was weak. It was pathetic. "Yes, Your Honor," I corrected him. My voice was ice. He took a breath. "Yes, Your Honor." "You argue in your brief that the chain of custody for the server logs is intact," I said, leaning forward slightly. "However, I noted a gap of 48 hours between the seizure of the drives from Oakhaven's headquarters and their arrival at the FBI forensic lab. During those 48 hours, the drives were in the possession of a third-party courier." Ethan stared at me. He had not expected me to read the footnotes. He had barely read them himself. He assumed I would gloss over the technicalities. He shuffled his papers. His hands were clumsy. "The courier is a certified government contractor, Your Honor." "That is not the question," I said. "The question is whether the seal was broken. Did you verify the digital hash values before and after the transport?" Ethan went silent. The confidence he had worn 2 minutes ago was dust. He looked at his junior associate, a young woman who looked terrified. She frantically flipped through a binder. We believe the integrity is preserved," Ethan said. "Belief is not evidence. Mr. Kincaid," I said, "you have until noon tomorrow to produce the hash value comparison. If you cannot prove the data remained unaltered during that 2-day window, I will suppress the entire batch of evidence. Do I make myself clear?" Ethan looked sick. That evidence was 40% of his case. "Yes, Your Honor. Crystal clear." "Good." I turned back to the defense. I spent the next 20 minutes dismantling their objections with the same surgical precision. I was efficient. I was fair. I was terrifying. I was everything Ethan had told the room I would not be. Ethan did not speak again unless I directly asked him a question. He sat there, pale and rigid, watching me as if I were a stranger wearing his sister's face. "We are adjourned," I said. "Counsel for the defense, you may go." Silverman and his team packed up quickly. Sensing the strange tension in the room and eager to escape it, they filed out, the door clicking shut behind them. Ethan stood up. He looked at the door. He wanted to run. He wanted to get out of this room and call our father and scream into the phone. "Mr. Kincaid?" I said. "Sit down." He froze. His back was to me. Slowly, he turned around. The room was empty now. Just the two of us and the silent court reporter who was packing her machine in the corner. I signaled for her to leave. She nodded and slipped out. Now we were truly alone. I did not step down from the bench. I stayed up high, looking down at him. The symbolism was not subtle. "Ethan," I said. He looked at me, his face crumbling into a mix of confusion and anger. "Natalie, what is this? What the hell is this?" "This is a courtroom," I said calmly, "and I am the presiding judge." You are Judge Vance?" He whispered the name like it was a curse. "You changed your name?" "I use my professional name. I have for 6 years." 6 years? He ran a hand through his perfect hair, ruining the style. "Does Dad know? Does Mom know?" "They never asked," I said, "and neither did you." He walked toward the bench, his hands gripping the railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. "You have to recuse yourself." "Do I?" I asked. "Yes, Jesus, Natalie, you are my sister. You cannot preside over my case. It is a conflict of interest. It is unethical." "Is it?" I opened the Code of Conduct book that lay on my desk. Canon 3, Section C, "A judge shall disqualify himself or herself in a proceeding in which the judge's impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Tell me, Mr. Kincaid, do you think I am partial to you?" He stopped. He looked at my face. He saw the coldness there. He saw the years of being ignored, of being silenced, of being uninvited. He realized with a jolt of terror that familial bias usually worked in favor of the relative, but in this case, he was not sure. I do not know," he said. "I have no financial interest in this case," I said. "I have no personal bias concerning the parties involved, unless, of course, you think our relationship is so close, so intimate, that I cannot be objective." I waited. This was the trap. If he said we were close, he had to admit that he had ignored my life for a decade. He had to admit that he knew nothing about me. If he said we were not close, he gave me the grounds to stay. He licked his lips. He looked at the door again. He was calculating the optics. If he filed a motion to recuse now, on the eve of trial, it would look like he was afraid of the judge. It would look weak. Waverly was watching this case. Waverly wanted to see him perform. If he ran away from a procedural challenge, he would look incompetent. And he was arrogant. Deep down, he still believed that he was the golden boy. He believed that even if I was angry, I was still just Natalie. I was still the little sister who folded. "We are not close," he said. His voice was tight. "We lead separate lives. We have not had a real conversation in years." "That is true," I said. "I can be objective," he said, straightening his tie. "I am a professional. I do not need favors." "I am not offering favors," I said. "Fine. Then I do not request a recusal." He tried to smile, but it looked like a grimace. "I can handle this. I can handle you." I closed the file with a sharp snap that echoed off the walls. "Let us be very clear about one thing. Mr. Kincaid," I said. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a shout. "You are not handling me. You are arguing a case in the United States District Court. You did not know I was a judge because you never asked. You assumed I was nothing because that was easier for your ego." I stood up. The black robe rippled around me. On Thursday, when you walk into this room, do not look for your sister. She is not here. She is at home, skipping a party she was told not to attend. The person sitting in this chair is Judge Vance, and she does not care who your father is. She does not care who your boss is. She cares about the law. I pointed to the door. Get out of my courtroom. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the look in my eyes stopped him. He turned and walked out. He did not strut. He walked fast, his head down, like a man fleeing a burning building. I watched the door close. My heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. He thought the shock was over. He thought the worst part was the surprise. He was wrong. He had no idea that I had already seen the name Sterling Ross Logistics in his evidence file. He had no idea that the real test was not who I was, but what I knew. Thursday was coming, and he was walking into it blind. Judge Malcolm Waverly was not merely a boss. In the intricate ecosystem of the federal judiciary, he was a monolith. He had sat on the bench for nearly 40 years, a man whose written opinions were studied in law schools across the country as if they were religious texts. He was the chief judge of the appellate court, a kingmaker who could elevate a career to the Supreme Court shortlist or bury it in the basement of bureaucratic obscurity with a single phone call. This was the man my father had casually referred to as your brother's boss in a text message. It was a gross oversimplification, typical of my family's inability to understand the scale of the world they were trying to manipulate. Ethan was an assistant United States attorney. Technically, he worked for the Department of Justice. Judge Waverly was the judiciary. They were separate branches of government. But in the social hierarchy of Chicago legal circles, Waverly was the sun, and everyone else was just cold dust looking for warmth. I sat in my chambers on Wednesday afternoon, the day before the trial was set to begin, and looked at the guest list for the retirement gala. I had not been sent the list, of course. I had acquired it through the same subpoena process I had used to request the financial records of Sterling Ross Logistics. It was a necessary part of my conflict check. I told myself I needed to know who was influencing the witnesses. There, at the top of the VIP table, was the name, the Honorable Malcolm Waverly. My brother had been busy. I knew exactly how Ethan had managed this. Waverly had a soft spot for what he called legacy families. He believed in the old-world idea of pedigree, that integrity and service were traits passed down through bloodlines like eye color. Ethan had undoubtedly spun a narrative for him over expensive lunches and charity mixers. He would have painted the Kincaids as a pillar of the community, a family of humble beginnings and soaring public service. He would have talked about our father, the hardworking corporate executive, and our mother, the devoted matriarch. And when Waverly inevitably asked, "Do you have siblings?" Ethan would have minimized me with a practiced smile. "Yes, a sister, Natalie. She works in the court system too. Clerical work. Very steady. We are very proud of her." He would make me sound small to make himself look big. He would make me sound boring so that Waverly would never bother to ask for my last name. If Waverly knew that Ethan's clerical sister was actually Judge Vance, the woman Waverly himself had publicly praised in a law review article 3 months ago, the lie would collapse. Ethan needed me to be invisible because my reality was too large for the box he had built for me. The danger of the retirement party was not just social awkwardness, it was exposure. If I walked into that ballroom, Waverly would see me. He would greet me as a peer. He would ask why Judge Vance was at a logistics manager's party, and when my father answered, "That is my daughter," the gap between Ethan's fiction and the truth would snap shut like a bear trap. That was why they had banned me. They were protecting the lie. I closed the guest list and opened the sealed envelope that had arrived on my desk an hour ago. It was marked sensitive, witness security. The Oakhaven financial case was not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about people who had been forced to cook the books. As I read the affidavit inside the envelope, the temperature in my veins dropped. The witness was a man named Arthur Pence. He was a mid-level accountant who had worked for a subsidiary of Oakhaven, but before that, 5 years ago, He had been a payroll manager at Sterling Ross Logistics. He was the bridge. The affidavit was a request for protective measures. Arthur Pence was terrified. He stated that he had been approached by two men in a parking garage who told him that loyalty is a lifetime contract. He was refusing to testify unless his identity was concealed until the moment he took the stand. I read his statement again. I processed the vendor payments. I know where the kickbacks went. They went to the regional managers. Regional managers, that was my father's title. I stared at the paper. My father was not a mobster. He was a man who clipped coupons and worried about the thermostat. But ambition is a powerful drug, and he had spent 30 years trying to give Ethan the life of a prince. Had he looked the other way when a vendor invoice came in padded with an extra $10,000? Had he signed papers he did not read because he was promised a bonus that would pay for Ethan's law school tuition? The tragedy was that I could see exactly how it happened. It was not malice. It was weakness. It was the desperate need to be more than he was. And now, Arthur Pence was going to take the stand in my courtroom on Thursday. I picked up my pen. I had a duty. I could not protect my father from the consequences of his actions, and I could not protect Ethan from the collision course he was on. My job was to protect the witness. I signed the order granting Arthur Pence the use of a pseudonym in public filings and authorizing the Marshal Service to transport him through the secure tunnels beneath the courthouse. I did not grant him total anonymity. The Constitution requires the accused to confront their accuser, but I ensured that no one, not even the prosecution, would know his location until he walked through the courtroom doors. I was playing by the book, strictly, rigidly. If Ethan had done his job, he would have interviewed Pence weeks ago. He would have known the connection. But Ethan had been too busy planning a party and rubbing elbows with Judge Waverly to dig into the dirty details of his own case. He was letting the junior associates handle the boring stuff. He was walking off a cliff, and he was dragging our father with him. I set the pen down. Tonight was the party, right now, in a ballroom at the Palmer House. Waiters were setting tables with silver cutlery. My mother was probably wearing her blue silk dress, the one she saved for weddings and funerals. My father was rehearsing his speech, a speech that would undoubtedly mention Ethan 5 times and me 0 times. Judge Waverly would be putting on his tuxedo, thinking he was about to spend a pleasant evening with a wholesome American family. I could pick up the phone. I could call Ethan. I could say, "There is a witness named Pence who used to work for Dad. You need to plea this case out right now before you destroy everything." It would be the sisterly thing to do. It would be the act of the good daughter who fixes the messes she did not make. But I looked at the text message on my phone again. Don't come. They had made their choice. They wanted to edit me out of the script. They wanted the glory without the foundation. I sat back in my chair and turned off the desk lamp. The room plunged into the gray twilight of the Chicago evening. I would not go to the party. I would not call. I would let the silence stretch out. I would let them have their night of champagne and applause. I would let them toast to a legacy that was built on quicksand. They wanted to pretend I did not exist? Fine, I would give them exactly what they asked for. I would be absent. But absence has a weight of its own. Tomorrow, in the cold light of courtroom 4, the vacuum I left behind would be filled by the truth. And when Judge Waverly looked from the witness stand to the defense table, and then up at the bench, he would finally see the whole picture. I stood up and walked to the closet to retrieve my coat. My movements were calm. There was no shaking. There was no hesitation. I felt the strange, cold peace of a surgeon scrubbing in for an operation that might kill the patient to save the body. The party was tonight, but the judgment was tomorrow. I walked out of my chambers and locked the door behind me. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed down the empty marble hallway like the closing of a coffin. It was 12:30 in the afternoon on Wednesday, when the knock on my chamber door interrupted the only 10 minutes of silence I had scheduled for myself. I was staring at a container of Greek yogurt, not eating it, just watching the condensation slide down the plastic. When my law clerk, Sarah, opened the door, she looked pale. In the hierarchy of the Dirksen Federal Building, law clerks were the infantry, and they knew exactly when a general was walking the halls. Judge Vance, she said, her voice dropping to a stage whisper. Judge Waverly is here. He is asking for a moment of your time. I put the lid back on the yogurt. Malcolm Waverly did not ask for time. He took it. He was the chief judge of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, a man who had been appointed by Reagan and had survived every administration since with his power not only intact, but calcified into something resembling granite. He was the boss my father was so terrified of offending. Send him in, I said. I stood up. It was a reflex. Even as a federal judge, even with my own lifetime appointment, the instinct to stand for Waverly was hardwired into the profession. He entered the room like a weather system. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with a mane of silver hair that looked like it had been brushed by a stylist 5 minutes ago. He wore a 3-piece charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first year of law school tuition. Natalie, he said. He used my first name. He was the only person in the building who did so without it sounding like an insult. Coming from him, it was a bestowal of favor. I hope I'm not interrupting your lunch. I saw the docket. You have a heavy afternoon. Judge Waverly, I said, gesturing to the leather guest chair. It is an honor. Please. He did not sit. He wandered over to my bookshelf, inspecting the spines of my legal texts. I was reading the transcript of your pretrial conference yesterday regarding the United States versus Oakhaven matter. The way you handled that discovery dispute regarding the digital hash values? Impressive. Thank you, I said, remaining standing behind my desk. The rules of evidence are not suggestions. No, they are not, he agreed. Turning to face me, his eyes were a piercing, icy blue, the kind of eyes that could spot a lie at 50 paces. Most young judges, and forgive me, but at 38, you are a child in this job. Most of them would have let the prosecution slide on a 48-hour chain of custody gap. They are afraid of slowing down the trial. But you have a steer. You hold the wheel steady. I do not like sloppy prosecution, I said. It was a dangerous thing to say, given who the prosecutor was, but I kept my voice neutral. Waverly chuckled. It was a dry, rasping sound. No, you do not. Speaking of the prosecution, young Kincaid is quite the talent, is he not? Aggressive, charismatic. He has the kind of courtroom presence you cannot teach. My stomach tightened, but my face remained a mask of polite interest. Mr. Kincaid is certainly spirited. He reminds me of myself at that age, Waverly said, leaning against my bookshelf. Hungry? A bit too eager to please? Perhaps, but that is useful if you know how to harness it. He has been bending my ear about his family for months. Apparently, his father is retiring from some logistics firm. Sterling Ross, I believe. I believe that is correct, I said. I am going to the party tonight, Waverly said, checking his watch, a vintage gold timepiece that ticked loudly in the quiet room. Ethan insisted. He seems to think his father is some sort of local hero. It is charming, in a way, the devotion. He looked at me then, really looked at me. It was the scrutiny of a man who spent his life dissecting human behavior. You know, he said slowly, Ethan talks about his family as if he carries the weight of their entire legacy on his shoulders. He mentioned he is effectively an only child, that the pressure to succeed is entirely on him. Is that true? The air in the room seemed to vanish. Effectively an only child. Ethan had not just minimized me, he had functionally aborted my existence to garnish his own sob story. He had painted himself as the lone warrior, the solitary hope of the Kincaid line, bearing the burden of parental expectation alone. It made for a better narrative. It made him look more heroic to a man like Waverly, who valued individual struggle. I felt a flash of heat rise up my neck, but I forced it down with the sheer weight of my training. I placed my hands flat on the desk, feeling the cool wood under my palms. I do not know the intricacies of Mr. Kincaid's personal narrative, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that threatened to ruin me. But I was under the impression that he has a sister. Waverly waved a hand dismissively. Oh, yes, he mentioned her, briefly. I think he said she works somewhere around the courts. A clerk, perhaps, or in the scheduling office. He implied it was a sore subject, that she lacked ambition, that she was content to stay in the background while he did the heavy lifting. The insult was so precise, so tailored to dismantle my professional identity, that it almost commanded respect. Ethan had taken my choice to be private and twisted it into a failure. He had turned my modesty into mediocrity. "Is that what he said?" I asked. "Something to that effect," Waverly said. "It is a shame. Talent is rarely distributed evenly in families. One child gets the drive, the other gets the stability." He turned to leave, seemingly satisfied that he had engaged in enough pleasant small talk with a junior colleague. He reached for the doorknob. I could have let him go. I could have stayed silent. It would have been the safe choice. It would have protected the secret until the moment I chose to reveal it. But the phrase lacked ambition was burning a hole in my chest. "Judge Waverly," I called out. He stopped and turned back, his eyebrows raised. "Yes, Natalie?" I walked around my desk. I moved slowly, deliberately. I stopped 4 feet away from him. I did not cross my arms. I let them hang by my sides, open and unafraid. "You are a man who values precision," I said. "I am," he replied, looking intrigued. "And you are a man who believes in the meritocracy of the bench, above all else." "Then let me ask you a hypothetical question," I said. "Do you believe that a person who works around the courts, someone who understands the machinery, the scheduling, the paperwork, the grinding reality of the system, is inherently incapable of sitting where I am sitting?" Waverly frowned. The question was sharp. It was personal, though he did not yet know why. "No," he said slowly. "Some of our best judges started as clerks. I myself started as a clerk for Justice Marshall." "Exactly," I said. "So perhaps, when Mr. Kincaid describes his sister as working around the courts, he is not describing a lack of ambition. Perhaps he is describing a proximity to the law that he himself does not possess." Waverly stared at me. His blue eyes narrowed. The gears behind them began to turn. He was replaying the conversation. He was processing the tone of my voice, the defensive edge I had just revealed, the strange familiarity I had with Ethan's narrative. He looked at my face, then he looked at the nameplate on my desk. Judge Natalie Vance. He knew I used a professional name. He knew my history was somewhat guarded. "Natalie," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "you seem to have a specific insight into the Kincaid family dynamics." "I observe, Judge Waverly," I said, stepping back, putting the distance back between us. "That is my job. I observe the parties before me, and sometimes I find that the stories counsel tells in the hallway do not match the evidence presented in the room." I held his gaze. I challenged him to ask the direct question. "Are you her?" But Waverly was too sharp for that. He realized he was standing on the edge of a revelation, and he realized that if he pushed now, he would ruin the game. He saw the fire in my eyes, the same fire he had praised 5 minutes ago. A slow, enigmatic smile spread across his face. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator recognizing another predator. "I see," he said softly. "Well, tonight's party should be illuminating." "I am sure it will be a lovely evening," I said. "Enjoy the speeches." "Oh, I intend to," Waverly said. "I always enjoy a good piece of fiction." He opened the door and walked out. I stood there for a long time after the latch clicked. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had gone off script. I had tipped my hand. But I did not regret it. Ethan had told Waverly I was a ghost. He had told him I was a failure. Tomorrow, in courtroom 4, Waverly would sit in the gallery. He would watch the ambitious brother fumble with the chain of custody, and he would watch the stable sister dissect him. And he would know. I went back to my desk and picked up the yogurt. I threw it in the trash. I was not hungry. I was ready. Wednesday evening did not bring the silence I had anticipated. Instead, It brought a courier to the lobby of my apartment building. He was not a uniformed delivery man from a major carrier. He was a private messenger, dressed in nondescript gray, holding a thick manila envelope sealed with red security tape. He did not ask for a signature. He simply verified my unit number, handed me the package, and vanished into the rainy Chicago night. There was no return address. I carried the envelope upstairs and placed it on my kitchen island. The red tape screamed a warning. As a federal judge, receiving ex parte communications, information sent to the judge by one party without the other party's knowledge, is strictly prohibited. It is a violation of due process. If this was a plea from the defense or a bribe from a witness, I would have to report it immediately. But the envelope did not feel like a bribe. It felt like a bomb. I sliced the tape open. Inside, there was no letter of explanation. There was no desperate handwritten note. There was only a stack of photocopied spreadsheets, printed emails, and internal accounting logs. The header on the first page made my breath catch in my throat. Oakhaven Financial, Internal Audit Log, Fiscal Year 2022. I began to read. What I held in my hands was the roadmap to the crime. It was the Rosetta Stone that Ethan and his team had been frantically searching for but had failed to find. The prosecution believed that Oakhaven was hiding assets. They were right, but they were looking for a complex offshore scheme involving Swiss banks and cryptocurrency. The reality, laid out in these rows and columns, was far more domestic. It was banal, and it was devastating. The documents outlined a system of re-invoicing. Oakhaven Financial would hire a vendor for a service, transportation, logistics, consulting. They would pay an invoice that was inflated by 300%. The vendor would take the legitimate cost of the service, keep a 10% administrative fee for their trouble, and then funnel the remaining surplus into a ghost account listed under capital improvements or fleet maintenance. I flipped the page. There was an email chain dated November of 2 years ago. The subject line was, Q4 adjustment, Sterling Ross. My hands went cold. The email was from the Chief Financial Officer of Oakhaven to a generic email address at Sterling Ross Logistics. It read, "We need to move $200,000 before the end of the quarter. Can you absorb this into the shipping manifest for the Midwest route? We will approve the surcharge on our end." The reply came 2 hours later. It was short. Approved. Send the revised invoice. The signature on the reply was not a name. It was a set of initials. G.K. Gordon Kincaid. I stared at the letters until they blurred. My father, the man who lectured me about saving 5 cents on a gallon of gas, the man who had built his entire identity around being a steadfast, honest provider. He was not just a passive participant. He was the approver. He was the gatekeeper who allowed the dirty money to flow from the criminal enterprise into the legitimate economy. I looked at the date again. November. That was the month they bought the new car. That was the month they paid off the remainder of the mortgage on the house. A wave of nausea hit me. I walked to the sink and gripped the edge of the counter. For years, I had felt like the failure of the family. I drove a sensible sedan. I lived in a modest apartment. I saved my federal salary. Meanwhile, my parents lived in comfort, and Ethan lived like a king. I had assumed they were just better with money than I was. I had assumed my father's investments had paid off. They had not paid off. They were being paid off. My family's comfortable life, the country club memberships, the expensive suits Ethan wore, it was all subsidized by fraud. They were not just erasing me from their social life. They were living inside a bubble of crime, and I was the needle waiting to pop it. I returned to the documents. I had a legal problem. I could not use these papers. They were anonymous. They were unauthenticated. If I walked into court tomorrow and waved them around, the defense would move for a mistrial, and they would win. I could not be the investigator. I had to remain the judge. But a judge has the power to ask questions. I looked at the specific dates in the spreadsheets. January 12th, March 4th, June 30th. These were the dates where the money moved. These were the dates where the ghost invoices were generated. I went to my laptop and logged into the secure court portal. I pulled up the evidentiary record that Ethan had submitted. I looked for the files corresponding to those specific dates. They were missing. The prosecution's data set had corrupted sectors for those exact weeks. Ethan had accepted the defense's explanation that it was a server error. He had not pushed. He had not subpoenaed the backup tapes from the off-site storage facility because he did not know exactly what he was looking for. He thought the money was in the Cayman Islands. He did not know it was in a logistics warehouse in Chicago. I sat down and began to type. I could not introduce the anonymous evidence, but I could issue a sua sponte order, an order on the court's own motion, regarding the sufficiency of the record. Order regarding preservation of electronic evidence and production of supplemental data. I typed fast, the keys clacking loudly in the empty apartment. The court, having reviewed the discovery materials, notes significant gaps in the financial ledgers for the dates of January 12th, March 4th, and June 30th. The explanation of server corruption is insufficient given the gravity of the charges. It is hereby ordered that the defendant, Oak Haven Financial, and all third-party vendors listed in the attached Schedule A shall immediately preserve all backup tapes, hard drives, and cloud-based data logs for the relevant period. No data shall be overwritten, deleted, or modified. It is further ordered that a special evidentiary hearing will be held on Thursday, May 15th, at 9 o'clock in the morning, to address these discrepancies. Counsel for the government and counsel for the defense shall be prepared to explain why these specific dates are missing from the official record. I added Sterling Ross Logistics to Schedule A. I hit File. The order was uploaded to the federal docket system instantly. An email notification would be sent to all attorneys of record. At the retirement party, in the middle of the speeches, Ethan's phone would buzz. He would check it, expecting a congratulatory text. Instead, he would see an order from Judge Vance. He would read it and probably roll his eyes. He would think I was being a pedant, fussing over missing dates that did not matter. He would not realize that I had just locked the doors to the burning building he was standing in. By issuing the preservation order, I had frozen the crime scene. If anyone at Sterling Ross or Oak Haven tried to delete those emails tonight, perhaps after a nervous phone call from a friend at the party, they would be committing a federal felony, obstruction of justice, and because I had flagged the specific dates, their IT departments would be on high alert. I was not investigating. I was ensuring that the investigation could not be killed. I sat back, my heart pounding. The anonymous document sat on the counter, a silent accusation. The person who sent these knew exactly who I was. They knew I was the judge. They knew who my father was. They knew I would have the power to do what the police could not. It was likely an internal accountant at Sterling Ross, someone like Arthur Pence, or perhaps someone even closer. I thought about Ethan. He was probably standing next to Judge Waverly right now, glass of scotch in hand, laughing about the good old days. He was boasting about his integrity. He was preening. He had no idea that his entire career was about to be collateral damage in a war he did not know he was fighting. My father was the tragic figure here, but Ethan was the fool. He was the prosecutor who was so obsessed with the big win that he failed to vet his own witnesses. If he had done a basic conflict check on Sterling Ross, he would have found the link. If he had looked at the vendor list, he would have seen our father's name. But Ethan did not look at details. He looked at headlines, and that blindness was going to cost him everything. I looked at the clock. It was 10 o'clock at night. The party was winding down. My parents were probably saying their goodbyes, feeling triumphant. They had pulled it off. They had kept the embarrassing daughter away. They had impressed the federal judge. They were safe. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I picked up the anonymous documents. I could not keep them. Possession of them was an ethical gray area. I walked to the shredder in my home office. I fed the pages into the machine, one by one. Oak Haven Financial, shredded. The email with my father's initials, shredded. The list of laundered funds, shredded. I did not need the papers anymore. I had the dates. I had the order on the docket. And tomorrow morning, under oath, I would force them to produce the official copies of the very documents I was destroying. I watched the last strip of paper disappear into the bin. The family drama was over. The hurt feelings, the exclusion, the childhood neglect. None of that mattered now. This was no longer about a daughter wanting her father's love. This was a federal crime, and I was the only person in the world who was willing to turn on the lights. I turned off the shredder. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the heavy, charged silence of a courtroom before the verdict is read. I went to my bedroom and laid out my clothes for tomorrow. I did not choose a suit. I chose my robe. I brushed it off, ensuring there was not a single speck of dust on the black fabric. Tomorrow was Thursday. Tomorrow, the skip my party text would become the most expensive message my father ever sent. I lay down in bed, but I did not sleep. I stared at the ceiling, visualizing the courtroom. I saw the bench. I saw the witness stand. I saw the defense table, and I saw Ethan, standing alone, realizing too late that the sister he erased was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. And she was no longer reaching out a hand to save him. She was picking up the gavel. I sat on my living room sofa, a cup of chamomile tea resting on a coaster. The room illuminated only by the soft glow of a floor lamp and the aggressive strobing light of my cell phone on the coffee table. I had set the device to Do Not Disturb, but I had left the screen notifications visible. It was a conscious choice. I wanted to see the blast radius, but I did not want to hear the explosion. It was 9 o'clock. By my calculation, the speeches at the Palmer House would be concluding. The roast beef would be cooling on the plates. The white wine would be making everyone a little too honest, and my father would be at the height of his glory. I closed my eyes and pictured the scene. I knew the script by heart because I had watched them rehearse it my entire life. My mother, Mary Ann, would be working the room, clutching the arm of anyone who looked important, whispering loudly about Ethan's vital work for the government. My father, Gordon, would be standing near the bar, chest puffed out, accepting handshakes for achievements that were largely administrative, and Ethan would be the centerpiece, the golden calf, smiling that practiced smile that worked on juries but had never worked on me. They were happy. They were safe. They were surrounded by 200 of their closest acquaintances, basking in the illusion that the Kincaid family was a monolith of success and respectability. Then the phone lit up. It started with a single text from a cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years. "Nat, is what this judge is saying true?" I took a sip of tea. It had begun. I did not need to be in the ballroom to know exactly what had happened. I had planted the seed with Judge Waverly in my chambers, but he was the one who had chosen to water it. I could imagine him standing there, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking like the embodiment of federal power. My father would have dragged him to the center of the circle, desperate to show off his trophy guest. "Everyone, this is Judge Malcolm Waverly," Gordon would have announced, his voice booming. "The chief judge of the appeals court, my son's boss." The crowd would have murmured appreciatively. This was the currency of my parents' world, proximity to power. Waverly, ever the polite guest, would have nodded. He would have complimented the venue. He would have said something gracious about Sterling Ross logistics, and then, with the surgical precision of a man who spent 40 years dissecting lies, he would have asked the question, "Gordon, it is a lovely party, but I am confused. I see your son, the prosecutor, but where is your daughter?" My father's smile would have faltered, just for a fraction of a second. This was the difficult question he had feared. This was the reason for the banishment. "Oh, Natalie," Gordon would have said, waving his hand as if swatting away a gnat. "She could not make it. She is very busy. You know how it is with paperwork." "Paperwork?" Waverly would have asked, his voice carrying over the sudden lull in conversation. "That is interesting. Ethan told me she works around the courts. I assumed she was a clerk or perhaps a paralegal." "Yes, something like that," my mother would have chimed in, eager to move the conversation back to Ethan. "She likes to stay behind the scenes. She is very shy, not a leader like Ethan." This was the moment. This was the pivot. In my apartment, I watched the notifications stack up on my screen. 3 more texts. 1 from an aunt, 2 from a family friend. OMG, Natalie. Why didn't you tell us? Your dad looks like he's going to have a heart attack. Is it true you are a federal judge? I could see Waverly's face in my mind. He would have paused, letting my parents' dismissal hang in the air like a foul odor. He would have looked at Ethan, who was likely turning a sickly shade of gray. That is odd, Waverly would have said, loud enough for the table of Sterling Ross executives to hear. Because I was reading the Chicago Legal Review last month. There was a feature on the rising stars of the federal bench. It profiled a Judge Natalie Vance, a brilliant legal mind, youngest appointment in the district, known for her absolute command of the courtroom. My father would have laughed nervously. Vance? No. No, you must be mistaken. Judge, our daughter is Natalie Kincaid. She just works in the building. Well, Waverly would have continued, twisting the knife. The article mentioned that Judge Vance's maiden name was Kincaid, and looking at Ethan, the family resemblance is undeniable. In fact, I spoke with Judge Vance yesterday, in her chambers. She has the same eyes as your son, though I must say, hers are significantly sharper. The silence in the ballroom must have been absolute. The clinking of silverware would have stopped. The waiters would have frozen. Judge Vance, my father would have whispered. The words would have tasted like ash in his mouth. Yes, Waverly would have said, delivering the final blow with a smile of innocent confusion. Did you not know? Your daughter is a United States District Judge. She presides over Courtroom 4. In fact, she is the presiding judge on the Oak Haven financial case, the very case your son is prosecuting. I watched the phone vibrate so hard it rattled the coaster. Incoming call. Mom. Incoming call. Dad. Incoming call. Ethan. I let them ring. I watched the names flash and fade, flash and fade. The humiliation in that ballroom would not be about my title. It would be about their ignorance. Waverly had just revealed to 200 people that Gordon and Marianne Kincaid knew so little about their own daughter that they did not know she was one of the most powerful people in the state of Illinois. He had exposed them not as modest parents, but as negligent ones. He had painted them as people who were so obsessed with the son's flash that they missed the daughter's substance. And worse, he had exposed the lie. They had told everyone I was a nobody because they were ashamed of me. Now, the room knew that the only reason to be ashamed was their own blindness. The text messages shifted tone. The shock was replaced by the Kincaid family specialty, deflection and blame. A text from Ethan popped up. It was a paragraph long. What did you do? Waverly just grilled Dad in front of the CEO. You set us up. You spoke to him, didn't you? You told him to say that. I look like an idiot. I look like I don't know my own family. You are selfish. Natalie, unbelievably selfish. You ruined Dad's night. I read the words and felt nothing. No sting, no guilt. Just a cold confirmation of everything I had suspected. Even now, faced with the reality of my success, Ethan did not feel pride. He felt threatened. He did not ask. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Why did you make me look bad? Then a text from my mother. Pick up the phone. Natalie, everyone is asking questions. Your father is in the bathroom. He is sick. How could you hide this? Why do you use a different name? Are you ashamed of us? To let a stranger tell us? It is cruel. You are cruel. Am I? I thought, was it cruel to accept a text message telling me not to come to a party because I wasn't good enough? Was it cruel to be erased for 30 years? I did not reply. I scrolled through the other messages. The guests were texting me now, people who hadn't spoken to me since high school. Congrats, Judge. That is wild. Your dad is stuttering. It is so awkward here. Waverly is eating dessert like nothing happened. This is legendary. I put the phone down. The party was effectively over. Oh, the band might play for another hour, and people might politely eat their cake, but the air had been sucked out of the room. The Kincaid narrative, the story of the golden son and the invisible daughter, had been shattered. But there was a darker undercurrent to the panic on my screen. My father wasn't just embarrassed. He was sick. He was hiding in the bathroom. Gordon Kincaid was a man who cared about appearances, yes, but he also cared about survival. And tonight, he had just learned that the judge presiding over the Oakhaven case, the case involving the fraudulent invoices he had signed, was not a stranger. She was the daughter he had alienated. He was realizing that the difficult questions he wanted to avoid were not about my job title. They were about his freedom. I imagined him staring into the bathroom mirror at the Palmer house, splashing cold water on his face, trying to reconcile the image of little Natalie with the terrifying reality of Judge Vance. He was realizing that he could not charm me, he could not bully me, and he certainly could not send me to my room. He was realizing that he had handed the keys to his destruction to the one person he had never bothered to know. I picked up my tea. It was cold now. I walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, in the rain, my family was crumbling. They were blaming me. They were spinning new lies to cover the old ones. They were telling themselves that I was the villain of this story. Let them. Tonight was the social execution. Tomorrow was the legal one. I went back to the phone and typed a single message. I did not send it to my mother, or my father, or the guests. I sent it to Ethan. See you in court. I turned off the phone. The room went dark. Save for the city lights, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The feeling of a heavy coat being taken off after a long winter. I was done being the daughter. I was done being the sister. I was the judge, and the court was now in session. The intercom buzzed at 6:15 in the morning. It was a harsh, jagged sound that cut through the silence of my apartment. I was already awake, fully dressed in my court attire, drinking black coffee and reviewing the evidentiary motion one last time. I did not need to ask who it was. My parents would never come here. They viewed the city as a dangerous inconvenience, and no colleague would dare disturb a federal judge on the morning of a trial. I pressed the button to unlock the lobby door. 3 minutes later, there was a knock. I opened the door. Ethan stood there. He looked terrible. The golden boy had tarnished overnight. His eyes were rimmed with red. His hair was unstyled, and he was wearing a hoodie under his suit jacket, a strange combination that screamed of a man who had dressed in the dark. In his hands, he held a cardboard carrier with 2 large coffee cups. "Peace offering," he said. His voice was raspy. He tried to smile, but it was a broken thing, a twitch of the lips that did not reach his eyes. "I figured you might need caffeine before today." I did not step aside to let him in immediately. I looked at the coffee. "I drink it black," I said. He looked down at the cups. "Oh, I got vanilla lattes. I thought that was what you liked." "I have not liked vanilla lattes since I was 22, I said. "But come in." I stepped back. Ethan walked into my apartment. He looked around, his eyes scanning the minimalist furniture, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the view of the gray morning sky. It was the first time my brother had ever set foot in my home. He had lived in the same city as me for 10 years, and he had never once asked to see where I lived. He set the coffees down on the kitchen island, right next to the empty space where the shredded documents had been the night before. "Nice place," he muttered. "Quiet." "It is," I said. "I like the quiet. It is honest." He turned to face me, leaning his hip against the counter. He took a deep breath, preparing the speech he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the elevator. "Look, Nat," he started. "About last night, I am sorry and okay? I am really sorry. I had no idea. Dad never told me. Mom never told me. I thought you were just, working in administration. If I had known you were a judge, I never would have sent that text. I never would have let Dad exclude you." It was a good apology. It hit the right notes of contrition and ignorance. It placed the blame on our parents while absolving him of malice. "You are sorry you got caught," I said. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the flat, neutral tone of a verdict. Ethan flinched. "That is not fair. I'm sorry I hurt you." "No, Ethan," I said. "You are sorry that Judge Waverly humiliated you. You are sorry that the narrative you built for yourself collapsed in front of an audience. It was not a narrative, he snapped, the defensive edge returning. I was just talking to my boss. I wanted to impress him. Is that a crime? It is not a crime, I said. But it is a lie. You told him you were effectively an only child. You told him you carried the family burden alone. You erased me not because you thought I was a clerk, but because having a sister who was your equal, or your superior, ruined your story. You needed to be the only star in the sky. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked down at his shoes. The fight went out of him. You have always been the quiet one, he whispered. I filled the space. That is what I do. I fill the space. And now the space is full of consequences, I said. He looked up, his eyes pleading. Can we reset? Please? Dad is a mess. He locked himself in the bathroom for an hour last night. He is terrified that you are going to be vindictive. Mom is crying. I just need to get through this trial. Nat, I need to win this case for Waverly. Once this is over, we can fix the family stuff. We can have dinner, real dinner. I looked at him. He really believed that. He believed that this was just a family squabble, a hurt feeling that could be smoothed over with a pasta dinner and a bottle of wine. He thought the problem was emotional. He did not realize the problem was criminal. Ethan, I said, sit down. I cannot stay long. I have to prep for the opening statement. Sit down, I ordered. He sat on the bar stool. He looked small. You are worried about the trial, I said. You want to impress Waverly. You want to convict Oakhaven Financial for fraud. Yes, he said. It is a slam dunk. They were moving money through shell companies. I just need to get the records admitted. And where did the money go, Ethan? I asked. He frowned. What? The money. Oakhaven inflated their vendor invoices. They paid 3 times the market rate for services. The vendors kept a cut and held the rest. Where did the money go? It went to offshore accounts, he said confidently. We are tracing it to the Caymans. You are looking too far away, I said. You should be looking at the vendor list. He stared at me. I do not understand. What are you trying to say? One of the primary vendors for Oakhaven is a company called Sterling Ross Logistics, I said. Ethan blinked. The name registered, but the connection did not click immediately. Sterling Ross? That is Dad's company. Yes. So? He asked. They are a big shipping firm. Oakhaven probably used them to move office supplies. It is a coincidence. It is not a coincidence, I said. And it is not office supplies. I reviewed the financial logs you submitted into evidence, the ones you did not bother to read closely because you were too busy planning a party. There are invoices from Oakhaven to Sterling Ross for amounts totaling nearly $400,000 over 2 years. The invoices are for consulting and priority routing, services that do not exist. Ethan went still. The color that had returned to his face drained away again, leaving him waxen. Wait, he said. Are you saying, whoa? I am saying that Sterling Ross is a pass-through entity, I said. They accept the inflated payments, scrub the money, and hold it, and someone at Sterling Ross has to approve those invoices. Someone with executive signing authority for regional operations. Ethan stood up. The stool scraped loudly against the floor. No, he said. No, that is impossible. Dad is cheap. He collects coupons. He is not a money launderer. Dad paid $60,000 for a party last night, I said. Did you ask him where that money came from? Or did you just assume he saved it from his salary? Ethan looked like he had been punched in the gut. He gripped the edge of the counter. His knuckles were white. The company paid for the party, he whispered. It was on the invitation, sponsored by Sterling Ross. Exactly, I said. A reward, a bonus for a job well done, a job that involved signing his name to fraudulent documents. Ethan began to pace the small kitchen. He ran his hands through his hair. Oh my God, if this is true, if Sterling Ross is involved, and I am the prosecutor, then you have a massive conflict of interest, I finished for him. He stopped pacing and looked at me. The panic in his eyes was primal. Natalie, if this comes out, if it comes out that my father is a target in my own investigation, Waverly will destroy me. He will think I knew. He will think I buried it. I will be disbarred. My career is over. He rushed toward me, grabbing my arm. His grip was tight, desperate. You cannot let that happen, he said. You are the judge. You can suppress that evidence. You can rule that the vendor list is irrelevant. You can limit the scope to the offshore accounts. Please, Nat, you have to help me. You have to help Dad. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. This was it. This was the moment the Kincaid family finally asked me for something real. Not for money, not for silence, but for complicity. They wanted me to use the power they had ignored to save them from the greed they had embraced. I pulled my arm away. No, I said. What? Ethan stepped back, stunned. Natalie, this is family. This is Dad. He could go to prison. Then he should not have committed fraud, I said. He probably didn't know, Ethan pleaded. He probably just signed what they put in front of him. You know how he is. He is not a mastermind. He is a cog. Ignorance is not a defense when you are an executive officer, I said. And neither is being your father. I am asking you for one thing, Ethan said, his voice cracking. One thing in your entire life. Just steer the case away from Sterling Ross. Nobody has to know. The feds will still get Oakhaven. Justice will still be served. Justice? I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. You do not want justice. Ethan, you want a cover-up. You want to walk into court today, impress your boss, win your medal, and go home to a celebration paid for by dirty money. I walked to the door and opened it. I am a federal judge, I said. I took an oath. That oath means more to me than your career. It means more to me than Dad's retirement party. You are going to ruin us, Ethan said. He was shaking. You are going to burn the whole house down. I did not build the house, Ethan, I said. I was never even allowed inside it. You and Dad built it. You built it on lies and fraud and vanity. If it burns, it is because you used flammable materials. I checked my watch. It is 7 o'clock. Court starts at 9. I suggest you go to your office and read the vendor list, because when I take the bench, I'm going to ask you about the missing dates in the record, and if you lie to me, I will hold you in contempt. Ethan stared at me. For the first time, he saw the reality. He saw that the sister he had dismissed as a background character was the author of the entire play. He realized that his success, his reputation, his entire shiny life was hanging by a thread, and I was holding the scissors. He did not say goodbye. He walked out the door, his steps heavy, stumbling slightly as he crossed the threshold. I closed the door. I looked at the 2 cups of coffee on the counter, the vanilla lattes, sugary, weak, and cold. I picked them up and poured them down the sink. The brown liquid swirled into the drain and disappeared. I rinsed the cups and threw them in the recycling bin. Then I went to the bathroom to finish getting ready. I applied my makeup with steady hands. I put on my earrings. Finally, I put on the robe. It was heavy on my shoulders, but it felt right. It felt like armor. I was ready for court. The phone began to ring 5 minutes after Ethan left. It was not a polite ring. It was a demand. I looked at the screen. It was the landline from my parents' house in the suburbs. They were calling together, likely huddled around the kitchen phone like generals in a bunker, trying to coordinate a retreat from the disaster of the previous night. I answered on the 3rd ring. I did not say hello. I simply pressed the green button and held the device to my ear. Natalie? My mother's voice was high and thin, vibrating with a frequency that usually preceded a guilt trip. Natalie, are you there? We have been trying to reach you all night. Your father is beside himself. He has not slept. He is sitting here at the table with his head in his hands. I am preparing for court. Mom, I said, I do not have time for a post-mortem of the party. How can you be so cold? She cried. After what you did. You humiliated us. You let that judge, that man, talk to your father like he was a fool. You made us look like liars in front of the most important people in Chicago. Do you have any idea how much face we lost last night?" "Face," I repeated. The word hung in the air, heavy and absurd. "Yes, face," my father's voice broke in. He had evidently snatched the phone from her. "You think this is a game, Natalie? You think it is funny to blindside your family? I have people calling me this morning asking if I knew my own daughter was a judge. They are laughing at me. You made me look incompetent." I walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the city scrubbed clean and gray. "Dad," I said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are worried about embarrassment. You are worried about social standing. But I need you to answer one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Don't you lecture me." "Stop talking and listen," I snapped. My voice was not loud, but it had the gavel-crack authority of the bench. My father fell silent. "Are you afraid because I am a judge?" I asked. "Or are you afraid because the numbers at Sterling Ross are not clean?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who has been caught holding the smoking gun. I could hear his breathing, ragged and shallow. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the background, but I did not hear a denial. He did not say, "My numbers are perfect." He did not say, "How dare you accuse me?" He said nothing. "Dad?" my mother whispered in the background. "Gordon? What is she talking about?" "I have to go," my father said. His voice was a husk. I have to make some calls." The line went dead. He had not hung up in anger. He had hung up in panic. My question had confirmed his worst fear, that I was not just an estranged daughter acting out of spite. I was a judge who had seen the ledger. By ending the call, he had given me the answer I dreaded. He knew. Maybe he didn't know the full extent of the Oak Haven fraud, but he knew enough to be terrified. I put the phone down. I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, but I boxed it up and shoved it into the mental compartment where I kept my personal life. I could not be Natalie Kincaid today. I had to be Judge Vance. I arrived at the Dirksen Federal Building at 8 o'clock. The atmosphere in the hallway outside Courtroom 4 was electric. The press had gotten wind of the subpoena I issued the night before. Reporters were milling about, sensing that the boring financial fraud case was about to mutate into something far more interesting. When I took the bench at 9 o'clock sharp, the gallery was full, and there, in the back row, sitting straight as a rod, was Judge Malcolm Waverly. He was not wearing his robes. He was in a suit, observing as a private citizen, but his presence was a message. He was watching Ethan. He was watching the defense, and most importantly, he was watching me. He wanted to see if the rising star he had praised could handle the pressure of prosecuting her own blood. "Calling the matter of the United States versus Oak Haven Financial," I said. My voice was steady, amplified by the microphone. Ethan stood up. He looked better than he had in my apartment, but the makeup artist had worked hard to hide the dark circles under his eyes. He moved stiffly, like a marionette whose strings were pulled too tight. "Ready for the government, Your Honor," he said. He did not look at me. He looked at the table. "Ready for the defense?" Silverman said. The defense attorney looked energized. He smelled blood in the water. "We are here for a special evidentiary hearing regarding the completeness of the financial record," I announced. "Mr. Kincaid, the court has identified significant gaps in the transaction logs provided by the government. Specifically, invoices relating to third-party vendors are missing for 3 distinct time periods." I recited the dates. They were the dates my father had signed the approvals. Silverman jumped up. "Your Honor, the defense moves for an immediate mistrial. The prosecution is clearly withholding exculpatory evidence. This is a Brady violation. Mr. Kincaid is cherry-picking the data to frame my client while hiding the involvement of other actors." It was a smart play. Silverman was trying to create chaos. He wanted to suggest that the government was corrupt, that Ethan was hiding evidence to protect someone. He did not know who, but he knew the smell of a cover-up. Mr. Kincaid? I asked. How do you respond? Ethan gripped the podium. He looked at Waverly in the back of the room. He looked at me. He was trapped. If he admitted the files were missing because of server error, he looked incompetent. If he admitted he hadn't looked for them, he looked negligent. Your Honor, Ethan stammered. We relied on the data provided by the FBI forensics team. We believe the record is complete as to the defendant's guilt. The missing dates are irrelevant to the core charges. The court disagrees, I said sharply. In a fraud case, the chain of payments is the only thing that matters. You cannot prosecute a river by only showing me the water at the mouth and ignoring the source. I leaned forward. I am denying the motion for a mistrial at this time. Mr. Silverman. However, I am issuing a compulsion order. Mr. Kincaid, you have 24 hours to produce the raw system logs from the Oakhaven servers. I do not want the spreadsheets. I want the metadata. I want to see who accessed those files, who deleted them, and when. Ethan went pale. The metadata? Yes, I said. If the files were deleted by accident, the logs will show a system error. If they were deleted by a user, the logs will show a username. And if they were deleted to hide a conspiracy, the logs will show us exactly who was trying to cover their tracks. I paused, letting the weight of the order settle on the room. Furthermore, I added, I am ordering the immediate production of all internal emails from the vendor known as Sterling Ross Logistics for the relevant period. These emails will be submitted directly to my chambers for in-camera review by tomorrow morning. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Ethan looked like he might vomit. He knew that if I read those emails in camera, meaning privately, in my office, I would see our father's name. I would see the GK signature. I would have the proof in my hands, legally obtained, authenticated by the court. I was forcing his hand. I was giving him one last chance to do the right thing. He could find the documents himself and turn them over, implicating his father but saving his professional integrity, or he could try to bury them, and I would find them anyway. Do you understand the order, Mr. Kincaid? I asked. Yes, Your Honor, he whispered. Good. We are in recess until tomorrow morning, Thursday. I banged the gavel. As I stood to leave, I glanced at the back of the room. Judge Waverly gave me a single, imperceptible nod. It was not a smile. It was a grade, A+. I retreated to my chambers. The adrenaline was fading, leaving me shaking. I sat in my chair and stared at the wall. I had just set the trap. I picked up my personal cell phone. I knew I shouldn't. Ex parte communication is forbidden. But this was not about the case. This was about a soul. I typed a text to Ethan. If you try to fix this by deleting those logs, you will go to federal prison. Do not be a martyr for a crime you did not commit. If you want to save your career, you have to let the truth break whatever it breaks. Thursday will crush you if you stand in front of it. I sent it. Then I turned off my phone. The doors were closing. My father was terrified. Ethan was cornered, and I was the one turning the key. I wondered if they finally understood that the admin girl they had ignored was the only one who knew how the machine actually worked. They thought kindness was silence. They thought love was looking the other way. I was about to teach them that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is force someone to face the light, even if it burns. Tomorrow was Thursday, the court date I had warned them about, the date they thought was just a calendar entry. They were about to find out it was a judgment day. Thursday arrived with the heavy, suffocating pressure of a storm that refused to break. Courtroom 4 was packed to capacity. The press had smelled the blood in the water after my preservation order, and they filled the back benches, their pens poised over notepads. At the defense table, the lawyers for Oakhaven Financial looked predatory. At the prosecution table, Ethan looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. And in the very last row, sitting alone, was Judge Malcolm Waverly. He was not taking notes. He was simply watching. He was the silent arbiter of the moral failure about to unfold. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. I ascended the bench. I did not look at my parents, who were huddled in the middle of the gallery. looking small and terrified. They had come because they were afraid to stay away. They needed to see if I would actually pull the trigger. I sat down. "Be seated." I looked at Ethan. "Mr. Kincaid, you were ordered to produce the unredacted system logs regarding the missing transaction dates. Do you have them?" Ethan stood up. His hands were shaking slightly. "Your Honor, the government has requested the files from the IT administrator at Oakhaven. We are waiting for the transfer." "You are waiting," I repeated. "The court is not waiting." I turned to the clerk. "Call the court's witness." The doors opened, and Arthur Pence walked in. A ripple of confusion went through the room. Ethan turned around, his eyes widening. He did not know who this man was. He had never interviewed him. He had never looked at the payroll of the subsidiary companies. "State your name for the record," I said. "Arthur Pence," the man said, his voice trembling but clear. "Former accounts manager for Sterling Ross Logistics." At the mention of the company name, my father let out a soft, strangled sound from the gallery. Every head in the room turned. Ethan froze. He looked at the witness, then at his father, and finally at me. The connection snapped into place. "Mr. Pence," I said, "you have brought physical evidence with you today?" "Yes, Your Honor." He placed a hard drive on the ledge of the witness stand. "I kept a mirror copy of the transaction ledger. I did not trust the instructions I was receiving from the executive office to clean up the quarterly reports." "And what do those reports show regarding the dates of January 12th and March 4th? "They show payments," Pence said. "Large transfers labeled as consulting fees moving from Oakhaven Financial directly to the operating accounts of Sterling Ross." "And who authorized the receipt of these funds?" I asked. Pence hesitated. He looked into the gallery. He looked directly at my father. "The authorization codes belong to the Vice President of Regional Operations," Pence said quietly. "Gordon Kincaid." The room did not gasp. It went dead silent. It was the silence of a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out. Ethan stood up, desperate. "Objection! This witness was not on the list. This is an ambush." "Overruled," I said. My voice was a hammer. "This is an evidentiary hearing regarding fraud on the court. If evidence was suppressed, I will hear it." But Ethan started. "Sit down, Mr. Kincaid," I ordered, "or I will have the marshals seat you." Ethan collapsed into his chair. He looked back at Waverly. The chief judge was staring at him with an expression of profound pity. It was over. Ethan had brought a case to trial without knowing that the target was his own father. He had boasted about his family legacy to the very man who was now watching that legacy dissolve into a puddle of corruption. "Mr. Pence," I continued, "do the logs show any activity in the last 24 hours?" "Yes, Your Honor," Pence said. "At 10:15 last night, an attempt was made to remotely access the Sterling Ross server and delete the email history corresponding to these transactions." 10:15, I said. That was 10 minutes after I had issued the preservation order. That was right after my father had hung up the phone with me. "So," I said, looking out at the courtroom, my eyes locking on my parents, "we have a cover-up. We have an attempt to destroy evidence after a federal order was issued to preserve it." My father had his head in his hands. My mother was weeping silently into a handkerchief. I turned to the defense table. "Mr. Silverman, your motion to dismiss the charges against Oakhaven is denied. However, I am issuing a new order. The United States Attorney's Office is recused from this matter immediately due to a gross conflict of interest. A special prosecutor will be appointed to investigate the relationship between Oakhaven Financial and Sterling Ross Logistics." I looked at Ethan. "And you, Mr. Kincaid, are referred to the Ethics Committee for failing to perform basic due diligence regarding the subjects of your investigation. You built a case on a foundation you did not bother to inspect." I banged the gavel. "This court is adjourned." The chaos that followed was immediate. Reporters shouted questions. The marshals moved to secure the witness. But I did not watch the room. I watched Waverly. He stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket. He walked over to the rail where Ethan was sitting. head bowed, defeated. Waverly did not yell. He leaned in and said something very quiet. I saw his lips move. You told me a story, Ethan, but you forgot that the ending has to be true. Waverly turned and walked out. He did not look back. 30 minutes later, in the quiet of my chambers, there was a knock on the private entrance. It was my father. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. His shoulders were slumped. The arrogance was gone, scraped away by the terror of public exposure. Natalie, he said. Sit, I said. He sat. He did not look at the books, or the robe, or the flag. He looked at his hands. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear to you, I didn't know it was illegal. They told me it was just accounting adjustments. They brought me the papers and they said, Gordon, sign here. It helps the quarterly bonus. I just signed. I thought I was being a team player. You signed invoices for services that did not exist, I said. You took the bonuses. You paid for the car. You paid for the party. I was trying to help, he cried, tears spilling onto his cheeks. I wanted to give Ethan a boost. I wanted us to be somebody. You were somebody, I said. You were my father. That should have been enough. I am so ashamed, he sobbed. To have my own daughter. To have you sit there and read my name. I have never been so humiliated. You shamed me, Natalie. I stood up. I walked around the desk and stood in front of him. I did not touch him. I could not absolve him. No, Dad, I said softly. I did not shame you. I did not embarrass you. The truth did that. I just turned on the light. If the room was dirty, that is not the fault of the switch. He looked up at me, and for the first time in his life, he saw me. He didn't see a clerk. He didn't see an annoyance. He saw a woman who possessed a strength he had never bothered to cultivate, the strength to endure reality. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said, you get a lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer, and you tell them everything. No more lies. No more protecting the family name. If you cooperate, if you testify against Oakhaven, you might avoid prison. But the party is over. I went to the door and opened it. I have a dinner reservation tonight, I said. At 7 o'clock? For 4 people? He blinked. Dinner? After this? Yes, I said. But there are conditions. If you come, and if Mom comes, and if Ethan comes, we are not the Kincaids of Sterling Ross anymore. We are just a family, and nobody talks about me as if I am invisible. You will introduce me to the waiter as Judge Vance, and you will listen when I speak. I looked down the hall, where Ethan was standing by the elevator, looking like a ghost. And Ethan, I said, loud enough for him to hear, if you want to save your career, you are going to walk into Judge Waverly's office tomorrow morning. You are going to apologize, and you are going to tell him exactly who your sister is. You are going to say the words out loud. My father stood up. He nodded slowly. Okay, Natalie. Judge Vance, I corrected him. He paused. Then, a flicker of genuine respect crossed his face. Okay, Judge Vance. He walked out. I closed the door. The storm had broken. The air was clear. I took off my robe and hung it in the closet. Underneath, I was just Natalie. But for the first time, that was more than enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and revelation, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help these stories reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.